So today I'm going to be talking about the 5 most common mistakes that I see new tessellation folders making and how we can avoid those or fix them if you've already made them. And these 5 mistakes have to do with paper choice, grid quality, the method of folding, so pre-crease and collapse versus folding twist by twist, the order of folding twists, and what projects you choose to take on. So I'm going to go through them in that order, talking about what the mistakes are that I see and how to fix them, like what materials, tools, and ideas are needed to get past these mistakes. First up is paper choice. So particularly if you haven't been part of the origami community for a while, you might think, oh, I'm going to do origami. Therefore, I'm going to use origami paper like you would pick up at a retail craft store. But that is very much a mistake because origami isn't just one thing. It's a whole lot of different techniques, and specifically what I'm talking about is origami tessellations. So repeating patterns folded from a single sheet of paper. This is a lot more complex than, say, a simple jumping frog or crane that you might learn on the playground. So this origami paper, the reason why it doesn't work well for tessellations is because it's too thin. And that's a benefit for a lot of animal folding, but it's a drawback when it comes to tessellations. Another reason is it's different colors on different sides. And with the tessellations, we have 2 sides that could be presented as the front. This particular one is the same pattern on each side, and I've got it marked up a bit because this is one I used to teach in my monthly membership, Tessellation Academy. And so we want these patterns to be presentable from both sides, and there's no particular guarantee that you won't have both sides of the paper visible around the edge. So what papers should you use instead? You're looking for a thicker paper, and one of the things that's great about origami tessellations is seeing the shadows as light shines through the paper. So this sheet is a paper called Star Dream. I wouldn't recommend this one either for seeing the shadows, although it would be pretty good for practice, because while it is a heavier paper, less prone to tearing, and easier to work with, and it is the same color on both sides, it's very opaque. So you'd have to use a lot of light to get those shadows. What I'd recommend instead is Skytone. And this is a paper that I sell in my paper packs. You can see links to it in the description below. And this paper has several benefits. First, it's pretty dialed in on the trade-off between too thin and tears easily and too thick and is therefore hard to work with, like from a force to fold it perspective. It's also very tough. It's very difficult to tear, and it can really take a beating and stay very nice. And then since it comes in light colors and it's not particularly opaque, you can see shadows through it. Like you can see the fingers of my hand behind the paper, even with the ambient light that we have here. So that's why I'd recommend Skytone. It's also a paper that I'm going to say hundreds of people have used for origami tessellations, a lot through the paper packs from my Advent of Tess series, and it's a very convenient size as well for folding. So the other parameter beyond thickness is size. And one of the things that I'll say is the question, can you fold tessellations on X paper, is always going to be yes. You can, but is it the best paper for beginners? No. So for example, you can fold a grid and fold a tessellation on, what is this, 2-inch, 3-inch harmony paper. You can do it, but should you do it starting out? Probably not. You can do a teeny tiny grid for your first grid, but should you? Probably not. Like, look at this. There's like 5 or 6 grid divisions just to get across my finger. That is ridiculously tiny. Instead, you want to start with grid divisions that are more comfortable in scale. So this particular grid has 24 divisions, and these are about 5-inch edges. And so that's the small size of hexagon template that's available at gatheringfolds.com. And this scale, I think, is really useful for learning tessellations, particularly for the advent of test pieces, because you get these divisions and they're still approximately finger size, slightly smaller than finger size. And you can still reach in most of the way to the center. And once you've folded a few twists, you will be able to reach in with one hand on the top and bottom to what you're working on. So that's a consideration of just like the size. And the size that you need is going to be very dependent on how many grid divisions you want to fold. So for example, for a beginner, I'd recommend like this hexagon with 5 inches per side for 24 grid divisions. But for me personally, maybe I would take that to 48. And then one of the other things, like you can see, this paper is very transparent. It's called glassine. The other variable that we're trying to moderate with the paper thickness is how easy it is to fold versus how easy it is to fold again in the same place. So with the grids, we're wanting to fold twice in the same place. And this is something that's a little hard to see, but right here, I've got a little scar in the paper. You can see a little gap between 2 folds. And that's because when I went to fold that grid line back to pop it back the other direction, the paper actually went and folded somewhere else. So that's another downside of using paper that's too thin. So that's our paper choice set of considerations. Then there's our grid quality set of considerations. So mistake number 2 is having grids that are not precise and not strong. So when we're folding a grid, it's important to start with an accurate shape, whether that's a square, a hexagon, a rectangle, whatever shape you choose to use, and then to fold accurately and precisely from there. And that I have a lot of trainings on in my Tessellation Foundation series, which you can find the link to down below, training.gatheringfolds.com/start. And in those lessons, I go over my tips of how to fold precisely. And we're not looking for infinite precision here. Like if we look at, say, this grid that I'm currently working on, which is a little bit insanely small, but my precision, like I can tell that I don't have absolute precision, not from just glancing at it, but since I've been working on it for a couple hours now, I've identified a few places where the precision is less than perfect, and that's okay. But what we don't want is big gaps where we should have tight grid intersections. And the second thing that we need, besides a precise starting shape, is firmly creased grid lines. So for firmly creased grid line, and actually while we're on the topic of precise shapes, these hexagon templates are made of acrylic, and they've got this brown coating layer on either side just so they don't get scratched. And the way that I use this this template is by grabbing a couple sheets of paper. Like I've got this green sheet and a couple white sheets. And I would lay them on a cutting mat, put my hexagon template on top, hold it down nice and firm, and use a rotary cutter, again, on a cutting mat, reveal the blade, and cut along each edge. That's the way I've found to make the most precise cuts quickly and get lots of good hexagons ready to go very quickly. Then for the actual folding of the grid, what I'd recommend, particularly when you're going with paper thicker than kami, and your thumb joints will thank me for this one, is use a bone folder. So a bone folder is a tool. It might be plastic, wood, or bone. Mine is actual bone. And the way you use it is once you've determined the location of a crease and set it in place with your fingers, then, so right now this crease is very loosely in place. It's kind of there, but it's not very permanent. And so we want to really smooth that down. I'm using a lot of force here to smooth out that crease. And now it's in a much more precise location, and it's very easy to flip the paper back and fold it to make that crease neutral. Another benefit of using the bone folder is that now when I go to fold the next crease, I can more easily identify where that previous crease was. So say I want to make this next fold to that previous crease. That's much easier to identify than if I had just this trying to reverse this is really shaky. If I had this very light crease, that's going to be harder to see than the one that I creased very firmly. And partly this thing of is it easy or hard to see has to do with your lighting. I recommend lighting kind of at an angle instead of straight down from the top. So when your light is at an angle, you can see much better when there are changes in orientation of the paper. So there's my recommendation for grid precision. Get actual physical templates for cutting out your hexagons. Paper tends to come in squares, but Skytone doesn't, so you might want to get specialized templates if you're cutting a lot of squares from Skytone. And then use a bone folder to get those grid lines super sharp. So now when I'm going to fold from these grid lines, I'm folding back and forth on these two lines that either use the bone folder or didn't use the bone folder. I'm noticing that I have a lot more resistance on the line that did not use the bone folder. So we want, when we are working on our tessellation, we want our grid lines to be super crisp and pop into place. So the bone folder is super helpful for that. And the bone folder and 2 sizes of templates and Skytone paper, along with a couple other tools, are all available in my full paper pack, which is linked in the description below. So that brings us to our next topic of how do you fold these things? So often when we're looking at origami tessellations, we'll either see a photo of a finished piece or we'll see a crease pattern. And the crease pattern shows you all of the little lines that are eventually going to be used. And I'll actually go ahead and bring up the crease pattern for this particular design. Just a moment. This is cluster 4 alternating, like from, I believe this was Advent of Test 2022, or wait, no, this is a cluster 6. Sorry about that. Cluster 6 alternating. There's a lot of naming convention things that can go on. So when you're looking at a crease pattern like this one, you might be tempted to say, oh, in figurative tessellations, in the animals and everything, when you see a crease pattern, you fold all of those creases on your paper and then collapse. But that's not how we do things in twist-based origami tessellations. There are some tessellations that do require pre-creasing and then collapse, but what I teach and the way I design my patterns is that you're going to make the new creases by folding the twist. And here I had 2 twists set up, and I'm going to use the bone folder again to smooth out those triangle twists, which creates the 3 additional off-grid folds that belong to each twist. So that is mistake number 3, trying to pre-crease everything and then collapse versus folding twists more on the fly. And then mistake number 4 has to do with the order of folding the twists. So often I'll see people fold like a central bit and then say, oh, I know what has to happen next. Let me do that specifically in all of the relevant locations. And tessellations don't work like that. I mean, you can, but you're going to get yourself into a world of plate overlap trouble. So instead, for tessellations, what I would recommend is trying to see the broader pattern and then say, okay, I'm going to work my way around. So let's say I was just here. I want to work my way around, and I'm going to add 1 twist. And notice here my grid lines are nice and crisp. They're doing exactly what I need them to do. And then I'm going to deal with this overlap between twists, which in this case, I'm going to set up from this side with a triangle twist and a triangle wrap. Don't worry, this is not a tutorial. I don't expect you to follow at this speed. And then I can go and squash the twist from the wrap. And what I'm going to do is work my way all the way around the part of the pattern that's in the center. And instead of doing this twist and then trying to find, okay, where's the next place that I can put that exact same twist, even though in this case all of the twists are closed triangles, but I'm saying that part of the broader pattern. Instead of saying that, I'm saying, okay, I put in a twist, it caused some pleat overlaps. So let's say in this case, I put in a twist, it caused some pleat overlaps. I am now going to go through and resolve all of those pleat overlaps, not necessarily all at once. So it's okay to have pleat overlaps, but you're working through in a sequence to resolve these overlaps. And in this particular case, I don't necessarily need to jump to these triangle wraps right away. I can keep going and make a whole sequence of wraps that can be squashed once I flip the paper over. But the underlying concept is that we're folding one twist at a time and working our way along the whole edge until we don't have any overlaps on that edge. Then we can go to the next edge. In this particular case, what I'm seeing is this is our last edge to work on, and once that's done, we'll have an even amount of pattern all around the center. So that's mistake number 4 of instead of saying, okay, I have this bit, I'm going to immediately do these identical bits, saying, okay, we're going to work our way along the edge, and we're going to do whatever needs to be done to resolve the pleat overlaps on that edge, and then we'll move to the next edge. So it's a different order of how to fold the twists, even once you've decided that you're going to be folding twist by twist. So then our 5th and final mistake is looking at a pattern and saying, that can't be so hard. Let me go ahead and jump straight to folding that one. Like, actually, for example, if someone was working on this piece and successfully folded this piece, and then went and tried to jump into folding this one, because they have the same center, right? How hard could it be? But that's actually a huge difference in skill level needed to fold this pattern with all triangles versus this pattern with triangles and trapezoids, which are close together on opposite sides of the paper. So yeah, even once you've started folding tessellations, like, that's not one difficulty level. There's a whole world of difficulty within origami tessellations. Like, there's simpler patterns like the ones that I teach in tessellation foundations, like this wave pattern or the daisy chain variant. And those simpler patterns are going to help set you up for patterns that are a little bit harder. And even this one, I wouldn't say is a one step from those tessellation foundations patterns. I'd say this is a couple steps in. You need to know the triangle wrap. That step of having twists on both sides of the paper is a big step for most folders. And so between this pattern of triangles and this pattern of trapezoids are probably several steps involving a tour of rhombus twists, which are kind of, well, hexagons first, then rhombus twists, then get into the trapezoids. But something along the way would be a pattern like this one that also uses only triangle and trapezoid twists, but uses them all on one side of the paper. And you get to practice both the right and left hand forms of both of these shapes of twist. So these two actually are the beginner and advanced tutorials for January of the Tessellation Academy membership. And that's one of the things that I really try to emphasize in that membership, is that there are patterns that are more beginner friendly and patterns that are more advanced. And yeah, like earlier was saying in the chat, these patterns are not easy. Just because you see someone has folded a cleanly folded version of it doesn't mean it's easy. And even like for me, when I was teaching that dancing pyramids pattern with the trapezoids and triangles on alternating sides of the paper, that was a challenge to figure out even how to teach it with more repeats. Like, it's a pattern that I had taught the center as a fairly easy center in Advent of Tess, I want to say 2023. But folding more repeats is an entirely harder problem. And actually, on the topic of folding more repeats, one other common pattern, common mistake pattern that I see besides the, oh, I see the next twist to add, let me add it in every location. Another common mistake pattern that I see is, oh, I folded the center from the center out, therefore the next repeat starts at the center of that repeat and goes out from there, right? No. No, we always want to be growing out from the single center, and eventually we'll pass repeats of copies of the center. But we are not relating to these motifs as whole motifs. They are collections of twists. And so we're adding layers of twists as we work around and around and around, and those may happen to include repeats of the center. So that's my advice for everyone who is looking at starting folding origami tessellations. Actually two resources that I hadn't mentioned yet are Basic Twist Bootcamp and Tessellation Starter Sequence. Those are so in the chat, redoing each center, like starting and hopping out somewhere else. First, you have to count and figure out where exactly that should be. And second, you're going to have a world of mess between one center and the next until you get those connected up, and then you're still going to have a ton of pleat overlaps on either side. So after you work through tessellation foundations, I'd recommend going through either one of the Advent of Tess series to practice just centers of things. And then when you're ready to start working with more repeats, with more patterns, I'd recommend Basic Twist Bootcamp or Tessellation Starter Sequence, because these are my courses where you really hone in on, okay, for this shape, and this is how that shape repeats, this is how the shape connects together, what are we going to add in each layer around the center? And for Tessellation Starter Sequence, since it has 50 lessons compared to the 10 in Basic Twist Bootcamp, you really get into, okay, so if I have a hexagons and triangles pattern, like let's say I grab my grid. Say we have a hexagons and triangles pattern. We've got an open hexagon in the center. And then we're going to do a a triangle twist next to the hexagon. So there we don't just see one example, like in the basic twist bootcamp lessons, where it would be open hexagon, okay, we're putting the open triangle on the same side. Well, in tessellation starter sequence, we get to see not only the open hexagon with the open triangle, but also, and I'm pulling up my examples, so I even remember it, because even with 50 patterns that I teach in tessellation starter sequence, there's still more that could have been included. So we would see this open hexagon and then with a closed triangle on the same side. And then we would see that open hexagon with a closed triangle on the opposite side. And then we would see, okay, what if we do this open hexagon with a closed triangle on the same side, but then we do a different hexagon next? And we also get to see patterns that start with this hexagon and then go triangle, then rhombus. We see patterns that start with this hexagon and then go directly to a rhombus. There's so many different variations that you can have, even with the same particular starting point. So really, to understand origami tessellations, to be able to sit there and say, okay, I'm going to add one layer of twists, you need to have that understanding of what is the next layer of twists? Where do they go in this pattern? What shapes do they have? How do they interact with the next things happening? And that really comes from repetition and seeing the underlying patterns that are in common between a lot of different origami tessellation designs. So that's my underlying advice, is you can actually reach a point where you understand, okay, this is what needs to be done next. It's going to be a triangle on this side. So in this particular case, I would say, oh, all of these pleats that I want to work on next are coming from triangles that are on this side of the paper, but in the pattern as a whole, every pleat coming from a twist goes to a twist on the opposite side. So the twists on these pleats need to be on the opposite side. And then I would say, okay, well, they're all going to be triangles because we're only working with triangles. So that means I'm going to have a triangle on each of these pleats, and I'm also going to have triangles in between the pleats where I'm going to have intersections between things that are going on. And then I look at the specific pattern and I say, okay, for each of these twists, there's this rule that I can follow, which is 2 of the twists are close, like at the closed hole, and 1 is far. So for this pleat, it's coming from a triangle hole that already has 2 close neighbors. And so I go an extra spacing away to add my next triangle. And then I can go ahead and squash, smooth it out with my bone folder, go to the next one and say, okay, this pleat is coming from that triangle hole. It already has a far neighbor. It needs a close neighbor. So I'm going to put in the next triangle. And by the way, if I remember correctly, this particular piece that I'm adding to right now came from an office hour for the Basic Twist Bootcamp course. So it's not just the 10 lessons in the course and then you're on your own. There's 10 lessons, There's also 10 bonus patterns, so crease patterns that give you some more ideas of how these twists can be used. And then, and then also recordings of the office hours that have been going on for over a year, where people have been asking questions, and you can also come and get your questions answered live. So Chris actually is the student who brought up this pattern in that office hour. And so when I'm looking at where the twist goes, and I'll go ahead and break out the pens. I'm looking at, okay, from this hole, I have this pleat coming out, and it has 2 close neighbors. I need a far neighbor, so I just marked in red the grid intersection that's going to be the center of the new triangle twist. So that's going to have a valley fold 1 space away at the corner of the twist. And that valley fold is going to cross the existing mountain and go down to the existing valley, and then create a 3-way intersection. So it's just like this 3-way intersection of mountains on this side, but it's a 3-way intersection of valleys that, once I squash the twist and flip the paper over, is now a 3-way intersection of mountains because I flipped the paper over, and ready to be squashed into new triangle twists. So there's a ton of different skills that build up as you as you practice more and more difficult origami tessellations, and things like the triangle wraps or squashing twists in this setting where you have a lot of other folds going on, instead of having one twist on a small grid in isolation. These are things that you build as you go, and then eventually you get into some pretty crazy patterns. And this one is crazy even for me. I was going to bring this out actually when I was talking about, okay, once you finish a center, you add a layer instead of jumping to the next center and working out. Because this one is pretty insane, but it still has a pleated border, somewhat miraculously. Well, math miraculously. I knew it was going to have a border. And yeah, so this would be an example of another pattern that would be even further ahead than this dancing pyramids with the triangles and trapezoids. So there's always a new challenge when it comes to origami tessellations, and it's not something that you can finish. It's not something that you can conquer. But there's always another pattern to try, another one to learn, another new technique to master. And that's why I'm still folding origami tessellations even after I've designed over 600 of them. So that's my summary of some of the pitfalls that I see facing early tessellation folding learners, and some of the ways that you can get around them, so you can go ahead and fold the beautiful patterns that you want to fold and not fold snowballs that end up in the trash can. So that's all from me today. Happy folding, everyone, and see you next week for a tutorial that actually will use triangle twists.